wanted, first of all, to thank all of you that are sharing this 1 hour with us, and Harold Susan that I will present in a few minutes. Wanted also to say that today, as most of you, if not all of you, know, it's the International Day of Portuguese Language. It has been declared by the United Nations a year ago, stressing the worldwide dimension of a language which is no longer property of a single culture. I think this is the basic understanding of languages that are considered of world relevance. And in this sense, in fact, the Portuguese is a language that has encompassed a large number of words, concepts, ways of thinking which are not originally European. And this is, of course, interesting for many of us who are interested in the process of building identities, cultures, and cultural landscapes. I also want to thank many of you who have contributed to an initiative that the Museum of Mação took yesterday to identify the words through which the collaborators of Mação understand Portuguese language. I would also take the moment to ask all of you who are collaborating in the research of DICLAM Master Program and working with questionnaires to send me by the end of the day a first feedback on the number of replies and any other comments you wish to make. But of course, what brings us today here is not this, is the first of a series of conferences which are organized by the APHELEIA Network on Humanities and Cultural Integrated Landscape Management, together with the Polytechnic of Tomar and the Municipality of Mação. But also in this one in particular, which is the opening conference, this is co-organized by 2 research centers from the Portuguese research science system, the Geosciences Center of Coimbra University and the Smart Cities Innovation Center of the Polytechnic of Tomar. And you will understand why. It's because we have with us today Professor Harold Susan, which many of you already know from reading. Some got more recently some publications he recommended, but you have also heard about him in different occasions. Professor Susan is a professor of New York University, both in liberal arts and in the Faculty of Engineering. Also professor at Beihang University and several universities in China, but also in many other countries. He is very well known and, if I may say so, a remarkable philosopher who has focused his research in looking at traditional ways of thinking and acting and behavior and modern technology. And he does this through a series of insights on the philosophy and history of science and technology, about philosophy, epistemology, and ethics, in particular, ethics in technology. Is also, and this is the context in which I have first met him, a leading scholar, member of the Asian New Humanities Network, who is an important partner of many activities we undertake in Tomar and Mação. And he is currently very strongly involved in the reflections within the International Council of Philosophy and Human Sciences to design, to conceive a new program or new project. We still have to sort out exactly how, on humanities and technology. Professor Harold Susan, thank you very much for joining us. And the floor is now yours. I will invite you to also upload your PowerPoint presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. And I think you can see the slides now, is that correct?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so Well, first of all, thank you, Louise. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this. I wish that, as originally planned, we were going to be together in Nassau right now. It's a delightful place in our memory, and we look forward to coming back there again soon. I didn't know until yesterday that today was the International Day of the Portuguese Language. I might have tried to learn a few Portuguese words for your amusement, and I would have maybe made the emphasis of my talk a little bit more around issues having to do explicitly with language. As it is, I'm going to refer to the philosopher Martin Heidegger, who talks in his work quite a bit about language and is well known for the comment that language is the house of being, or as Louise put it in the email I saw yesterday about this International Day of Language. Pretty much everything passes through language, the way we understand it, the way we experience it, the way we are in relationship to everything is mediated in a profound way by language. What I'm going to do today is to try to weave together several very, very big ideas. This is, I hope, going to work as a kind of opening or a kind of introduction to thought for you, as I won't have time to really drill down on any of the arguments. But I want to note that in weaving together issues from the humanities and technology and the social, we see that undergirding all three is a presumption of the possibility of knowledge. As you all know better than I do, the Latin word for knowledge is scientia, and so in this sense, science in a broad way is the foundation for, or the presumption of the possibility of science, at least is the undergirding or the foundation or the support or the prompting of most issues in the humanities and technology and the social. In modern world, we have given science the authority as the standard of knowledge. That is to say, modern science that we think of in the narrower sense of science is now somehow what we think of as the standard for what all knowledge is. And so it's that point that is going to be the focus that I try to play with in my comments this morning, or this afternoon, I guess. In the abstract, a couple of points that I want to just highlight a bit is that one, technological consciousness. I'll try to help you understand what I mean by that in a few minutes. But technological consciousness pervades thought about everything. It's, you know, sort of ubiquitous. It's omnipresent. It is, in a sense, where we, I think, live today, in sort of the house of technological consciousness, that sense of the house of language. So if technological consciousness is as significant and influential in how we understand everything as I believe, I want to pay a little bit particular attention to how scientific inquiry incorporates the technology. Now, let me see, I need to, yeah. Okay, so what I'm trying to do, of course, in this talk is to introduce and show how several important theoretical issues, arcane, you might originally think, theoretical issues intersect with economic and social developments, which have in turn been deeply influenced by modern technology. So these issues, as I see them, have been framed for us by early modern science. This framing has led to research practices, scientific research practices, which I think, if they are not examined or if we're not mindful about what they are, may lead in some way to the distortion or misinterpretation of results. Now, a principle that I think we need to keep in mind is the idea of scientific universalism. I'm commending to all of you a very important book, a classic in the sociology of science, called The Rise of Early Modern Science, and it's cross-cultural by looking at not only the Western development of modern science, but also the development of science in China and Islam by Toby Huff. And he develops the notion of scientific universalism in this book, sort of resting on two cardinal principles. One is that knowledge claims to be judged impersonally, and two, all persons should be freely admitted into the world of scientific discourse. This is the idea of scientific universalism. This, in a sense, gives legitimacy to science. It means that it is not my, personal or self-interested perspective, or my perspective as determined or developed by my society or culture, but it is something which is equally accessible to everyone, any place, anytime. Now, we need to question this, I think. I think that notion of scientific universalism is an ideal of science, but it's maybe been a little bit too easily accepted, in the sense that it is too easily assumed to be something that we have. Okay, so how am I going to try to handle all of the many topics and this big sort of thematic thing that I have? And I thought that I would do it by posing a kind of straightforward, simple, practical question about scientific research, and ask, well, has the, over time, the growing reliance on high technology to the point where now it's almost unthinkable to conduct scientific research without using one or another bits of high-tech support. Has this changed the nature of scientific investigation, and has it possibly introduced unrecognized biases? Or in other words, has the use of technology maybe undermined the ideal of objectivities of scientific universalism? So that's the question. And this is actually, I think, an empirical question. And so I'm not going to be able to answer it. But I want to try to unpack why I think it's a vitally important question. And to do that, I'm going to refer to several philosophers. I'm going to try to put this straightforward empirical question into philosophical perspective, and try to reflect in this way on some of the complicated interactions that obtain among individuals, as individuals, societies, or cultures. And then I want to add machines, that is to say, those those mediating tools, and then nature, or being. Now, the phrase science is the mirror of nature is something that is something of a commonplace. I know of its use in European history of science quite a bit, also in the history of science in China. It's a term that's well used. And so let's just kind of keep this metaphor in our minds and ask, is science a mirror of nature? Now, to say that let me go back and just elaborate a little bit more on that. To say that science is a mirror of nature would mean that what science is a kind of representation of nature. So what is it that is the means of representation? There are all kinds of forms of representation. There's kind of what we take a mirror or a photograph to be, something that simply is, a copy of what is there plain enough to see. But there are other notions of representation. For example, the Portuguese ambassador to the United States, for example, represents Portugal, but she or he does not resemble Portugal in this kind of sense of a picture. So perhaps there's some sort of representational function between nature, the objective of scientific inquiry, and then the structure that we produce. And this, of course, seems to be what we presume when we use digital technology. Okay, so here's an example, and I've chosen an example from archaeology, and I've chosen the example from some work that is being heralded by my neighbors at the University of Chicago, in which they are very proudly proclaiming that they use the most up-to-date, modern, sophisticated technology in every aspect of the research, and they incorporate it into their teaching, and so that the training of scientists, the training of archaeologists, or the training of Egyptologists, and so on and so forth, is all done with modern digital technology. And the claim is the celebration, the reason for celebrating this is that they say it just makes it so much better, so much more complete, and that you don't miss details, and that some of the stress and effort of doing many calculations or many observations or many copies and so on, this is now automated so that fatigue or human error doesn't enter in, and all of this kind of stuff. So seems all good, but I remember a while back reading about one of the unexpected consequences when the card catalog at Harvard University was the old-fashioned kind of card catalog with drawers that you pull out and cards that you look at, was replaced by a digital catalog. And now, of course, all modern research laboratories have digital catalogs, and we all celebrate that because it means that we can look up so much more quickly, so easily, consult many libraries, and so on and so forth. But the story was that somebody going through some of the traditional older card catalogs found that they were, well, they reflected, some individual's perspective. There were little scribbles or notes on them, where you could tell by the way they were handled so many times how often it had been, looked at, and so on and so forth. So in other words, something quite personal is sort of eradicated by the use of the digital thing, and maybe some kind of knowledge is lost, or at least we don't benefit from the multiplicity of perspectives. So at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, they say at all archaeological dig sites, technology is transforming every phase of research. And they talk about their own history, taking pictures from hot air balloons in the 20s and 30s, later from blimps. And now they're using remote sensing, portable x-rays, 3D scanners, and many other sophisticated tools to map and analyze findings. That is to say, to find them, to analyze them, to interpret them, to catalog them, and so on and so forth. So that's my example. It does something like this, which on the face of it seems as though it must be just fantastic, have any what you might call a downside, in the sense that we miss something or may miss something, or we may make certain presumptions, or we come to expect two things. One, that data is nicely organized, because maybe the first time that we get to see it and work with it, it is very nicely organized. Secondly, that it's in a way invisible to us without this technology. In other words, it's not something that we have a natural relationship to or an unmediated relationship to. Our relationship to it is only via this kind of technology. And this kind of technology, I often describe it in terms that engineers like to use as a kind of black box. We don't know what's inside the black box. It's a technological tool. We put something into it, an inquiry or whatever, and out comes a set of answers. But exactly how those answers are produced is a bit of a mystery, hidden inside the black box. And frankly, many of us would not be able, if we looked inside the black box, to know what we were looking at. Imagine you open your computer and you look at the motherboard and you see all sorts of things there, and it hardly dispels, looking at it in this way, hardly dispels to the non-electronics computer engineer the sense of magic that we get. So that's kind of the issue. That's the empirical question. I'm sure all of you have many examples of how your research is aided by technology. And so keep those in mind as I raise these questions. Now, I'm going to just make reference to three philosophers important in the 20th century who each come at this from a different perspective, but each has, I think, the common concern that I'm trying to deal with. And these are not the only three philosophers that have reflected on this. These are the three that I chose for today. And they've all been influential, and they've all, in a sense, been controversial for various reasons, but their ideas have not, been, granted the kind of, aha, oh, he's got it right. This is a wow insight. No, when they have written things, people have responded to them, acknowledging the power and depth and sort of penetration of what they're saying, but not with the acknowledgement universally that, aha, this is right, and this is where we're going. So all three figures are, to a greater or lesser extent, still controversial. So these three thinkers are at the top, Martin Heidegger, and then to the right in the middle is Bruno Latour, and the bottom one is Michel Foucault. And these are names I'm sure you're familiar with, and you may have read some of their works, and I distributed some selections from them, which I didn't think you needed to look at ahead of time, but maybe you might want to look at them now. So we'll begin with Heidegger. And Heidegger, in a lecture later published, spoke of what he called the Die Frage nach der Technik, or the question concerning technology. Not the question of technology, but the question about technology, or the question that technology imposes on us. And it's the question, in his mind, it's the question that we have to come to terms with because of its importance, because of the kind of growing influence technology is having. I should say that although Heidegger says this is a question concerning technology, I think he most explicitly means the question concerning modern technology, modern scientific technology, that is technology which is so much more powerful, technology which sort of takes over from us. It's not like the technology of the ballpoint pen, because there I write my Portuguese vocabulary down and try to learn it, but I am in control of this, and it's my intention, my decision, so on and so forth. But modern scientific technology, and this is, of course, becoming even more than Heidegger probably ever anticipated through the powers of cybernetics and so on, is becoming more and more autonomous. So let me just read the first paragraph or so from this text of his, which sort of makes very clear, I think, the issue. He says, and I'll read it in English for you. In what follows, we shall be questioning technology, questioning concerning technology. Questioning builds a way. We would be advised, therefore, above all, to pay heed to the way and not to fix our attention on isolated sentences or topics. The way is one of thinking. All ways of thinking, more or less perceptibly, lead through language in a manner that is extraordinary. We shall be questioning concerning technology, and in so doing, we should like to prepare a free relationship to it. And this is the theme that I'm trying to underscore with Heidegger, is this idea of what is the possibility of a free relation to technology. It's not, by the way, ignoring technology. It's not saying we're not going to use it because, well, then technology has determined that choice and we're not freely related to it. We are sort of forced into hiding from it, perhaps, if we were to do that. So the question concerning technology and a free relationship to it does not suggest anything that is anti-technology. It is rather more of a call to our understanding of how we are related to technology. And I put it this way, how we are related to technology, which I will sort of pick up again when I talk about Latour. The relationship to technology, Heidegger says, will be free if it opens our human existence to the essence of technology. When we can respond to this essence, we should be able to experience the technological within its own bounds. Technology itself is not equivalent to the essence of technology. When we are seeking essence of a tree, we have to become aware that what pervades every tree as tree is not in itself a tree that can be encountered among other trees. So the essence of technology is that which sort of makes technology what it is, but it is itself not technology. And so examples of technologies won't necessarily reveal the essence of technology. And if we have a good grasp of the essence of technology, that doesn't mean that what we have grasped are the details of the technological device. So he says, likewise, the essence of technology is by no means anything technological. Thus, we shall never experience a relationship to the essence of technology as long as we merely represent and pursue the technological, put up with it, or evade it. Okay, so this is the cue for my question. If by embracing the modern, amazing, powerful tools of technology available to, say, archaeological researchers, is that like pursuing the technology without understanding at all the essence of technology, and in that way not having a not being able to have a free relationship to it, and in that way, perhaps being misled in our understanding of the results we get. Okay, so now we go to the second philosopher, Michel Foucault, and he contextualizes the issue of technology along with science in an interesting way. He makes a kind of automatic correlation between issues of power and control and knowledge or science. So in other words, science is not this kind of, as suggested by the mirror of science metaphor, it's not, I'm looking back and gazing on something and seeing it without my own interested attempt to control or manipulate it or regulate it. No, rather, he's seeing science as unavoidably related to issues of control, trying to control what we understand, trying to control what we're investigating, and so on and so forth. And in that way, he very insightfully compares it to what's going on in various kinds of institutions, which we don't, in the first instance, think of as institutions of science, such as prisons and hospitals, even universities. Okay, so he, in this text, fortuitously enough, given the conditions that we're living under today, relates this to the experience of a plague. He says, the measures taken when the plague appeared in a town. First, strict spatial partitioning, the closing of a town and its outlying districts, a prohibition to leave the town on pain of death, the killing of all stray animals, the division of the town into distinct quarters, each governed by an intendant. Each street is placed under the authority of a syndic who keeps it under surveillance. If he leaves the street, he will be condemned to death, and so on. By the way, my sort of recreational reading these days of being contained by the coronavirus happens to be Albert Camus' novel, The Plague. Camus describes this response exactly in this way, and it's of course more or less what we are experiencing now. At any rate, it leads to the idea of the need to have very careful, very thorough inspection. The gaze is alert everywhere, a considerable body of militia commanded by good officers and men of substance guard the gates, the town hall, and every quarter ensure the prompt obedience of the people and most absolute authority of the magistrates, as also to engender disorder, theft, and extortion. Okay, now here's where he's going to go. This is, in a way, a problem of science, and this problem of science in turn becomes a problem of technology. It's a problem of science in the sense that science is to be, aware of everything, observe everything, but of course this is impossible. When the Jesuits first came to China, as you know, I think they were very, very interested in persuading the emperor that Western science was more accurate, more effective than Chinese science, because, and therefore could predict the important events in the calendar, things like eclipses or just the phases of the moon and things like this, which had ritualistic mandates following from them more accurately. And therefore the emperor would be more powerful if he adopted Western science, because he would have more accurate predictions. He would make more accurate predictions about celestial events, and in that way be able to be more effective in his role of controlling the nation. And of course, the Jesuits had the nice twist that Western science went along with their religion, and so the access to this science was, in a sense, predicated on conversion. Well, that didn't happen. At any rate, many of the Jesuits, who were quite good astronomers, visited the observatories in China because they did not believe. They did not believe that the Chinese observations could be accurate because, well, it just takes so much, and they were doing it without the advantages of Western technology. So you can see that the possibility of scientific investigation, as Foucault is telling it, relates to two things. It stems out in two ways. One, the need for sort of ongoing, perpetual surveillance on the one hand, and on the other hand, how this is got as its outcome, as its desired outcome, or a sort of reason for doing it, the possibility of control. All right, so Foucault, the man on the right there with his cat, is interested in a project that was undertaken by Jeremy Bentham, who you see in the center on the bottom there. That's not Bentham himself, that's at his wish, his body was mummified and made into what he called an auto icon, which is now permanently on display at the University of London. At any rate, that's what that is. Bentham's brother was working for Potemkin, Prince Potemkin, in White Russia and Belarus, and advised him that one way to control things was to build an all-seeing technological device that he called a panopticon. Well, it was never done in what's now Belarus, but Bentham sort of embraced the project and designed this panopticon as a prison, and you see one of the architectural renderings of it above there. And the idea was to have an ever-seeing eye. That would mean that through technology, you could observe all of the prisoners all of the time, and therefore discipline them. It would save money. It would result in better order in the prisons. Would lead to greater security, and so on. This project was never realized, but Foucault picks up on an interesting aspect of it. And that is that let us suppose that it actually didn't work. By the way, this opens the door to all sorts of accounts that you're familiar with, sort of 1984 kind of accounts as well. But even if the panopticon's ability to observe everybody all the time was an exaggeration, the people in the prison, the inmates, would be restrained because it would be possible that it was observing them. And so now I want to raise this question in two ways. Foucault, commenting on Bentham's never realized panopticon prison project, talks about how the prisoners, behavior and actions are changed because of what they believe the power of this technology is to regulate and control them. And what I want to ask in addition to that is, well, let's take the other side of it. How about the people operating the machinery and their beliefs in it and their reliance on it? Is that as perhaps sort of exaggerated as the inmates might be? So the question, remember Heidegger said it was the question becomes multiplied. And I can see at least several questions. how do we have a free relation to technology? Does technology create an unnatural order? And then ultimately, does technoscience determine what is observed? And here I think we can sort of digress momentarily and be a little bit theoretical and talk about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It doesn't only have to apply to physics. You know, I mean, the indeterminacy that Heisenberg expressed in his equations, as you see up there, can be sort of expanded in ways that you know, might include less precise in the sense of you know, quantifiable results and measurements kinds of sciences, and could even extend into ordinary experience. The notion of uncertainty, as I note there on the right, has been applied in ways that extend beyond the particular implication that Heisenberg had in mind. Bruno Latour. Referring to a book called Reassembling the Social, which is, he calls an introduction to his actor network theory. So he sees agency, and agency in the sense of both controlling and understanding and changing and benefiting. In other words, all of the theoretical and scientific and social and psychological and aesthetic kinds of activity that we undertake as humans is got to be understood in terms of what he calls actor networks, where there's a variety of actors. One of the aspects of Latour's theory that has generated some of the controversy around him is his inclusion in these networks, actor network. Okay, so anyway, then there's familiarity about that, and let me move ahead because my time is running out. Let's put these issues together. How do we put the issues together? I'm suggesting that new kinds of connections, improbable connections, may be necessary. Here I refer back again to the idea of the mirror of nature. Richard Rorty down here wrote a book in 1979 that was extraordinarily powerful and which dispelled the idea of the mirror of nature metaphor and the idea of representationalist thinking in science. So that's sort of where we're getting to, or at least as far as I'm getting at this point, is that if we don't understand what we learn in science as, in a sense, representing something else, then what is it and how do we understand it and what is its meaning and how can we be sure that we are looking at it in a way which is not either subjugating ourselves to some external attempt to regulate or control us, or perhaps just happening as a result of having what Heidegger would call an unfree relation to technology. Okay, so in summary, the takeaways, something that Toby Huff has developed in his book to a great extent is the global history of science shows the importance of the institutions that structure the research. And when those institutions have more than one purpose, such as the purpose is, in the case of the scientific institutions, trying to manage the COVID-19 virus, they're purposes are not simply to understand what that is, but through understanding it to regulate it and ameliorate our living conditions and to put us into a situation where we will ultimately appreciate the government's role. Another point, the idea of scientific knowledge as kind of a pure, universal, undistorted mirror image is greatly exaggerated. This was an idea that emerged very strongly in the scientific and analogical revolution of the 17th century with the Copernican revolution, follow-ups and so on. We live, I would say, most of us in an unfree relation to technology, partly because technology's speed at sort of developing and changing and assuming new powers and capabilities is almost outstripping our imagination, our ability to grasp it. And we are finding ourselves more and more dependent on technology, whether that's our desire or not. The Foucaultian point, practices of science in some ways resemble those of prisons and hospitals. Let's say that both prisons and hospitals have, as their objective or their goal, the good. Techno-science is that kind of science which through technology hopes to build a better world. Famous ad slogan of a company, multinational company, not so well known anymore, E.I. DuPont, was better things for better living through chemistry. And that's the kind of message of techno-science. And then finally, and I think we now would all agree, we don't stand apart from nature or machines, but do we go pretty much as far as Latour and sort of welcome machines into our communities. So that's what I hope introduces a few ideas to you in an interesting way. Again, thanks so much for the opportunity to do this, and maybe there will be some questions.
Thank you very much, Harold. Very, very interesting. I think we have some time now yet. So if anyone wants to raise any question, just make me a sign and we'll give the floor.
Don't be shy. I said enough confusing things. You might like me to try to be a little bit more clear. That would be fine.
I have some questions myself, but I would like to give the room to someone else. If yes, no one for the moment. I had many questions actually, but maybe two questions. One is you mentioned Foucault and this understanding of his of society as being and states as being a combination of monitoring and punish non-normal behavior, non-accommodated behavior. And so this, as you have mentioned, these observations in the context of plagues. But would you agree to say that we have, of course, examples of that in the current pandemic context, but we also have, interestingly, in many countries, in democratic spaces, the fact that you are using monitoring is there, and there is a presence of some discourses which would go in the direction of punishing, but there is a growing trend not to punish, but to share the information and to try to convince individual actor, positive convergent agency, we could call it. Do you think this can be observed in these days or not? And I don't know if it's a related question, but it relates to the pandemic in any case, and to the way we look at technology and so on, which is the statements of the World Health Organization, which is being criticized by many, but for other reasons. But the World Health Organization resumed its earlier declaration on traditional medicine, saying that it welcomes, in the context of COVID-19, the contributions of traditional knowledge, fostering the interest of having it grounded on demonstrated evidence, and saying that traditional knowledge should be given, particularly speaking about Africa, given the chance to also have a saying and a capacity to demonstrate its benefits in the case of the pandemic crisis. How do you see these issues in relation to what you've been talking about, our relation to technology and the way philosophers of the 20th century have seen it?
Yeah, okay, so these really hit the nail on the head, both questions, and I see them as related questions. So, you know, first of all, we're in the 21st century now, and time is racing by so fast that some of the kinds of alarming aspects of some of the concerns raised by, say, Heidegger and Foucault have, you know, sort of been observed and absorbed, and there are things happening. I think there's a couple of ways in which we can see a dialogue going on. So first of all, with Foucault, maybe we would put the emphasis more on discipline rather than punish. Discipline being kind of ordering, regularizing, allowing for predictability, and so on. In the current pandemic crisis, I think that there is a hope, a strong hope, and desire for some kind of regularity, regularizing of it, some kind of notion of achieving that through good practices, through discipline, and so on. So that I think that in a way we can see what Foucault is talking about as not being, you know, entirely one-sided or coming from an oppressive authority, but something which now has got many voices and many sources and kind of a dialogue being created. There still, I believe, though, is a strong belief, kind of almost magical thinking type of belief in the efficacy of technology. As we are aware, a lot of the talk about the virus characterizes it as something which is invisible, almost unknowable. We want to be able to do battle, as it were, or defend ourselves, or somehow be able to contain or constrain this virus in a way so that we can pursue our own objectives. Given the nature of the quote-unquote enemy, we tend to look to technology as something which is going to facilitate our ability to do this. Now, leading into the kind of embrace of traditional medicine, you know, I think that the interest in traditional medicine that is being seen so often now is based on the idea that traditional medicine can be understood in a way that's scientific after all. You have the expression complementary medicine, which usually means that some kind of Western scientific view of treatment, usually a theory based on bacteria and the containment or the annihilation of bacteria as how medicine works, being complemented by sort of alternative approaches, which can be nevertheless validated through similar sorts of scientific things, measures, sort of tests of its effectiveness. So the issue of sharing that you bring up, I see that in terms of a dialogue or a sort of multi-node source of power, the kind of thing that Latour is describing. And as far as the acceptance of traditional medicines, I think that it is, in a way, the putting traditional medicine into the general category of scientific medicine, validating it or claiming that it can and should be validated by the same kinds of metrics as regular medicine, and in many cases calling it complementary, which presumes a sort of equity or equality of it. That's the same kind of dialogical structure in both cases. Anyway, that's a few thoughts I have about that.
Thank you very much, Harold. I think maybe someone else wants to use the very few minutes we still have left, or not.
Well, my hope was to open up some questions, and I think that if questions are challenging people, then I will have achieved what I want. And there's many open paths in front of the questions, I think. So perhaps that will be, sort of the possibility for everyone.
Yeah, I also think there is room for questions, and I'm sure that people will come with questions, but sometimes people feel afraid. Oh, I get one. George.
I think I have a question.
Yes.
I was just shy a little bit, but also
Please,
regarding about
state your name for Harold to know. Okay.
I'm Georgia Sagum from the Philippines under the DCLAM program. Also regarding about the discussion about Foucault and the surveillance society, and now we're in this pandemic. I just want to know what do you think about the efforts of other countries like Singapore, China, and now I think I've read Czech Republic will also implement it, about the use of technology to survey or to have a surveillance to people, to the citizen, in regards to the pandemic right now.
Okay, George, thank you. That's a really good question. And I, as Louise mentioned in the introduction, have lived in China, and so I'm familiar with the potential for surveillance that is in place there, and been following how it's been used, and I think to mostly very, very good effect in terms of containing and managing the outbreak of the virus. I participated in a webinar with public health physicians from China, South Korea, and the UK recently, and they were talking about the issues of surveillance in terms of regulating the spread of the virus, and in terms of protecting people. The fellow from Korea said that in South Korea, people were very, very appreciative of the means, which are very similar to what was done in China, where they sort of monitor where everybody who has been exposed goes, where they buy groceries if they go to a movie or something like that, report it to anyone who may have come in contact with them. In other words, a complete sort of automated mapping of everybody's movements and whether or not they were possibly exposed. And what the fellow from South Korea said was, well, I'm sure this would not be acceptable in every country in the world, but here in South Korea, people wanted it more and more. They felt that it was really beneficial and helpful to them. On the other hand, in the United States, the very idea of surveillance is used as a sort of example of the worst of all possible powers that a government could have. And people wring their hands about it quite a bit and are, saying that it is the equivalent to totalitarian rule. I understand, I guess, both sides of this issue, and I think it's something that we need to, try to think through very, very hard. I don't think it's an either-or situation. Of course, surveillance technology can be abused, but it can also be used in ways that maybe are last best hope in some cases. How we think it through, I don't know. I don't think that the day-to-day political discourse that we all follow is doing anything like thinking it through. It's polarizing attitudes. I think we need to do something more like Heidegger suggests in terms of understanding what this technology is and how our relationship is to it. I think we need to sort of join forces with a kind of actor network business and recognize that the world that we live in is populated not only by humans but by machines, and that the issue of agency is distributed across them. So it's a very complex question. Whereas I was feeling in response to Louise's question, a little bit of optimism about sharing and collaboration and cooperation and dialogue in terms of the specific issue of the uses of surveillance for these purposes. I think that we're seeing a growing polarization and mutual suspicion. And so it's going in both directions simultaneously. It's quite, quite confusing and quite concerning to see that.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Anyone else wants to raise any question? I give you my second question, or my third, but it will be a brief one, because I was wondering, following what you mentioned about Heidegger and his focus on the way, on der Weg. And this sounds, it could be read in different ways, but my question is, could we read this approach closer to the notion of Tao in Chinese philosophy, for example, which is different from the traditional European approach to science, which is focused on the end, on not in the process, but in the end, in the output. But if you focus more on the process, could this be that technology, after having contributed to bring a more similar framework of doing things in the world, could it also have an impact in philosophy and in understandings of processes in the East and the West?
Well, this is a big question, and there's lots of discussions in the literature about this. Um, and it's for one thing, Heidegger had in mind the Tao of Eastern philosophy when he used this. Although, if you look at his texts carefully enough, you see that in some ways, the way he describes it, you know, he didn't understand Taoism, or he used this idea of the way in multiple fashions. At any rate, the short answer that I always give to the question is yes, I think there is a similarity, and I think it's an important one, and I think it should be the basis for understanding. I've been invited to be part of a project which is centered at the East China Normal University, where the current president happens to be an engineer and also completely involved in sort of application of Taoist studies. And so he has sort of gotten a lot of support and put together a very large team of people to try to disseminate thinkings about Taoism that might have an applicability to scientific research practices globally. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes and what kind of receptivity it has. But I think that, you know, what Heidegger is reacting to is a kind of absolutism and sort of criteria of certainty that emerged in, you know, the writings of, for example, Descartes, where, you know, for Descartes, something, in order to be acceptable as a scientific proposition, had to be beyond any possible doubt, had to be certain or indubitable in a sense. And Heidegger is certainly challenging that in every way and saying that going forward, we need to follow a way or a path, and this is going to be something that is not, you know, straight and narrow, but is wandering and which opens various things for disclosure that we hadn't anticipated.
Thank you very much, Harold. If no one else wants to raise any question, and also because we are now a little bit over the time, I thank you very much, Harold. It was, I think, a wonderful opening of our conference series. And we will be in touch. It is highly possible that other people will send you some questions or send to me and I will forward to you. But anyway, I don't know if you want to say anything else.
Well, just thank you for giving me this opportunity. And, you know, whenever you try to present something and draw your ideas together, it's a very wonderful experience and helps you recognize what more you need to understand. And that's certainly my case. I would be more than happy to respond to anybody's questions, however they want to get them to me. If they want to send an email or anything like that, if you want to forward them, or you want to share my email address with people who, in case they want to follow up with me, I would definitely be happy to respond. So thanks a whole lot. This was great.
Thank you very much. We were counting on having you 3D this year. For various reasons, this didn't happen in the end because of the COVID, as we all know. But I'm convinced, I'm sure actually, that in the near future, when we will be able to travel again, to welcome you in Portugal and to continue the work that we have started to discuss, also engaging our colleagues in engineering for a project with the Polytechnic of Tomar. Thank you very much.
Great. I look forward to that.
And see you soon, I hope.
I hope. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.